Well, I think I need to begin by expressing appreciation for the opportunity to be on this lectureship. It's my first time to be on the Truth and Love lectures. And I see a lot of faces out there that I've come across over the years. I forget the names, but I still remember the face. But it's so good to be here. I do appreciate the invitation. And Brother Burns handed me my little sack that is given to all the preachers. And as I was pilfering through that sack and looking at what was in that sack, I was looking forward to the lesson that Jimmy Clark gave, and then I got to thinking maybe I ought to turn that sack back in, Jonathan. It's got peppermints in it, it's got crackers in it, it's got a bottle of water in it, lust of the flesh, and even preachers are sometimes enticed by things like that. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. There's a Father up above looking down in tender love, so be careful, little eyes, what you see. We learned that song from the time that we were children in Vacation Bible School. And it taught us a very important lesson that not only is there a God who sees us, but we have the amazing opportunity to be able to see with this physical apparatus that God gave unto us, and to see some of the most beautiful things that God has created. Did you know that the first record of somebody seeing something is in Genesis chapter 1? And God had created the world, and it says that He saw what He had created, and He said it was good. I know God doesn't have physical eyes like we do, but He has the ability to see and to observe what we are and what we engage in. And He has passed that ability on to you and I, the ability to see with this human apparatus some of the most beautiful things of God's creation. In 1966, when I joined the United States Coast Guard, I visited my grandmother the weekend before I was sworn in Dallas, Texas, and she said, "You need to buy you a good camera, not one of these little Kodak Brownie cameras," and some of you have no idea what that is, but it was a very cheap camera. And she said, "You need to buy you a good camera." So as soon as I had the opportunity, I bought a Petri camera that had all kinds of adjustments on the lens, and she said, "You need to get you a good light meter." And unfortunately, when I saw something that I really wanted to take a good picture of, I'd have to stop, check the light, turn the dial, set this setting, and then I'd hold my camera up and it was gone. So it wasn't quite fast enough, was it? Well, over the years, we've developed some amazing cameras, have we not? And now we have the ability to reach into our pocket and take out this little device right here. And not only can we communicate with people literally around the world, we can hold this thing up and take a picture of this audience. And it's a remarkably good quality, is it not? Or if I wanted to reverse that thing, I could take a picture of myself. I've never understood what motivates people to take selfies, but they do nonetheless, do they not? Now, I want you to think about something. That when you look at this apparatus or you look at a camera, it's really quite astonishing that the mechanism in that camera, whatever make it is so amazing that how could anyone draw the conclusion that it was produced by an explosion in some kind of a lens factory? And yet people look at the human body and they look at the design of things around us, and they still conclude that somehow all of this evolved. Charles Darwin was challenged with this apparatus we call the human eye. And when he looked at that and he focused on that human eye, he found it very challenging that evolution could explain the existence of that human eye. And look what we can do with this. We can enjoy the beauties, the aesthetics of God's creation. Animals have eyes, but I don't get the impression that when they wake up in the morning or we take our little dog out for a walk that she sits back and she says, you know, it's a beautiful sunrise today, isn't it? Or it's a beautiful sunset tonight. You and I can look at the beauties and the colors, and we have an appreciation for those things. That's part of our eyes that God has given to us. And there's nothing quite as beautiful as a sunrise or a sunset, or to gaze at night up into the stars and to see the beauty of God's creation. But isn't it sad that the human race has taken such an amazing apparatus as this human eye, and he has abused that for his own purpose and desires? And that's why John warns us in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15 and 16 that one of the things that is of the world, one of these trios of sins that we're looking at this morning, that one of those is the abuse of using this eye, these eyes, to look upon the things around us in a way that's evil and out of harmony with His will. I want to deviate just a little bit. I have some information in the book. I'm going to read a couple of quotes to you out of that. But in 1991, James Patterson and Peter Kim conducted what they called a scientific survey. And I have no doubt to question, no reason to question what they put into it from the reports I read of their report. I've not acquired a copy of the full report, but I've looked at some of the analyses by individuals who have read that report. One of those was a fellow who examined the report, and he actually quoted from James Patterson and Peter Kim. And I want to read to you something that was in that report. Generally, it was a report to study the behavior of the American society, American people. In a more broad sense, I guess you could say it was an examination of how the Western world thinks. And even though this survey was conducted, 25 years ago, 26 years ago, what they write is really quite frightening. Let me read this to you. They drew this conclusion, quoting from Patterson and Kim: God is alive and very well in America, is what they're focusing on. But right now in America, fewer people are listening to what God has to say than ever before. 90% of the people we questioned said that they truly believed in God. It would be the logical conclusion then to think that God is a meaningful factor in today's America. But we reached a different conclusion when we dug deeper with our questions. In every single region of the country, when we ask how people make up their minds on issues of right and wrong, we found that they simply do not turn to God or religion to help them decide about seminal or moral issues of the day. For most people, religion plays virtually no role in shaping their opinions on a long list of important public questions. I didn't have to have a report to tell me that. If 90% of our country still claim to be Christians, why is it that abortion was not completely outlawed 35, 40 years ago? If we claim to be believers in God, how can we tolerate the kind of activity in our society, the approval of homosexual marriages? It's an obvious fact that people they're not listening to this book right here. In fact, they're not even examining what this book has to say. He goes on to say in this is true even for questions that seem closely related to religion: birth control, abortion, even teaching creationism and the role of women in the clergy. On not one of these questions did a majority of people seek the guidance of religion in finding answers. Most people do not even know what their church's position is on important issues. Well, if their report is anywhere close to accurate, then you can understand why we have a society today that continues the plunge into moral depravity, in spite of the fact that the Bible is still the #1 selling book in America, and why so many people hold to a faith in God. Gary Summers, who preaches for a congregation in Florida, he's always been a very excellent writer, very thorough researcher. He investigates everything that he comments on, and he wrote an article in his church bulletin about 3 or 4 months ago, I think it was, in which he drew these observations out of that report. He actually looked at the report and drew these conclusions, and here's some of the things that he shared with us. 91% of Americans admit to lying regularly. The percentage of spouses unfaithful to their partners is staggering. Cheating, dishonesty, theft, and embezzlement now seem to be a part of the very fabric of our society. Pertinent to our study for this hour, Summers also pointed out that we admitted, and I'm quoting from him, we admitted that we are profoundly affected by the lust of the eyes. And when I read that, I said, you talk about a relevant subject today. When we study things like the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the vainglory of life, these were not temptations that plagued an ancient world. They were not peculiar to Rome. They're temptations that face man in every single generation, and we haven't escaped that in spite of the fact that we have such a rich heritage in the teaching and the study of God's Word. And so this trio of sins, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the vainglory of life, helps me to see how Satan takes each one of these and puts these into his arsenal to attack us. And sometimes you have one of those that's not very effective on an individual, but the other one might be. But when you combine all three of these together, he's managed to make a tremendous impact upon the world in which we live, and not for the better, as is quite obviously the case. I'm going to do 4 things this morning. I want to look at the definition of some words, and then we're going to delineate. We're going to sort of draw that out and see the meaning of those words in certain particular areas. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the dangers, at least 2 of the dangers. And then last of all, we're just going to give you some very quick suggestions on defense. How can we protect ourselves against the lust of the eyes? Let's talk about some words for a minute. Any argument begins with a good defining of words. And when you look at this phrase, the lust of the eyes, obviously there are 2 important words that stand out. One of these is the word lust, and our English word translates a Greek word that is not always used in a bad connotation. But I took my Bible software, my computer, and I did a quick search on this English word lust, and it appeared about 41 times in the New Testament, and in every situation, without any exception, the translators saw fit to take that word to describe something that is bad, something that is evil. And there are numerous passages that use it in that negative context. For example, Matthew chapter 5, verses 24, you have heard that it was said, "Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh upon a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already in his heart." In Romans chapter 1, the word is used twice. The first time, reference is made to God giving man up to the lust of his heart. Man had reached a point in his trek away from God that essentially God just pulled off all restraints, and man plunged into the immorality that's set forth in great detail there in Romans chapter 1. 1 Thessalonians 4:5 talks about the passion of lust. You have lust appearing in the works of the flesh, but all of those things in a very negative connotation. And when you deal with the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes, there may be a temptation to say there's not a lot of difference in the two. I think there is a lot of difference in the two. And Marvin Vincent, in his series on word studies, came up with a description of this comparison, this contrast between the two, I share with you his words. The desire of the eyes does not involve appropriation. It is satisfied with contemplating. It represents a higher type of desire than the desire of the flesh, in that it seeks mental pleasure where the other seeks physical gratification. There is thus a significant hint in this passage that even high artistic gratification may have no fellowship with God. That's a great contrast, is it not? And so when we deal with the word lust, we're dealing with things that are negative, evil in their connotation. The next word that needs to be defined is this word eyes. And I'm not speaking about necessarily the physical eyes, though that becomes the gateway by which thoughts, sights, the lust of man are enticed by what he sees. So we're dealing with more than just the eyes. Lust of the eyes is taking the physical apparatus that God has made and using that for the distinct purpose of satisfying the desires, looking on things and meditating on things to the extent that it actually draws us away from God. Now, if we expand on that thought, we take the lust of the eyes and we add those two together, you combine the words, then I came up with this observation. What John is warning us against are those inordinate desires that originate from gazing upon some object so as to produce the temptation to turn away from that which is pure and holy and righteous and to embrace that which is contrary to the will of the Father. Throughout this series of lectures, have we not been reminded that the great danger in temptation is to turn away from the things that are right and put our mind, our desires, and to pursue the things of a fleshly nature so that we can fulfill the gratification of the flesh? Now, I want to give you two passages. I noticed when I was looking at my notes again, I said we're going to expand this and look at least two passages. I only gave you one in the book. That's one of those incidences where you start out and your mind runs ahead of your pen and you forget something. But I want you to look at two passages with me. One of these is Romans chapter 1, verse 24, to which I referred earlier, where it is said, God gave them up in the lusts of their heart unto uncleanness, that their bodies should be dishonored among themselves. So the inner man became so consumed with the things of the flesh, the fulfillment of the desires of the flesh, that essentially they made a choice. It was a willful choice. It says they chose to serve the creature rather than the Creator. And every commentary that I have consulted having to do with this they chose. It was a willful thing. You're not talking about a long era or drawn-out process here, though over the years their choice has affected others as well, has it not? The lust of the eyes, so focusing on things of a fleshly nature. Albert Barnes, I think he had a very noteworthy comment under his comments on 1 Corinthians chapter 4 when he talks about being babes. You don't want to be babes in spiritual things. You want to be mature in spiritual things. Here's his observation. That which is designed merely to gratify the sight. This would include, of course, costly raiments, jewels, gorgeous furniture, splendid palaces, pleasure, grounds, etc., etc. The object is to refer to the gay vanities of this world, the thing on which the eye delights to rest, where there is no higher object of life. Is it wrong to look at the beauty of an individual, a person? God made us beautiful. Is it wrong to look at the aesthetics in society and the things that surround us? No, it is when we abuse that. Now, there's another passage that I think is worthy of consideration. This is the one in James chapter 1, where James says, don't think that God tempts you. God does not tempt anyone. In fact, he himself is not tempted by sin. But every man is drawn away by his own lusts. And then when those lusts gaze and look, it becomes sin. And then sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. Don't miss the progress in that. There's a first step at which point the faithful child of God will take action immediately to reject the temptation, to turn his eyes or his desires away from that as soon as he recognizes the temptation. And here's, I think, an important lesson that we can grasp out of that passage in 1 John chapter 2. And that is, obviously, there's no sin in temptation. But when you look at those three avenues of sin, of temptation, sin, the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the vainglory of life, the key to overcoming is to reject that just as soon as the temptation becomes apparent. You've been warned, but you've also been armed, have you not? With the very scriptures that we're studying in this trio of lessons this morning. And so there's a definition. Now let's draw that out. So we're going to deal with a delineation next. We see the definition. Now we're going to delineate. By delineation, we mean a detailed description of what is involved. Or to put it another way, we're going to try to be more precise in looking at the words itself and coming to an understanding as to the danger and the temptation that is there. And I want to deal with two specific areas. Now, actually, lust of the eyes is sort of like an octopus. It's got these tentacles that just reach out in various areas. But we're going to look at this from two different aspects. One of these is using the eyes in order to look improperly upon the opposite sex for the satisfaction of one's desires. Is that a real danger? Our Lord thought it was. You have heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, whosoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery already with her in his heart. I think there's a couple of important lessons there. One is Jesus was teaching us that the eyes have the capability, a strong capability, of taking a person in the wrong direction. We're going to talk about some defense a little bit later. But there's another important lesson here as well. I want to make sure that I am not on the end of providing the opportunity for an improper glance on the part of someone else. Isn't that where modesty comes in? Living in such a way that my decorum and my attitude, my dress, that it reflects a godlike character and doesn't provide the opportunity for this fulfillment of the desires of the eyes. It is so dangerous, in fact, that when Peter wrote about false teachers in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 14, after telling us several things about these false teachers, he says they have eyes that are full of adultery that cannot cease from sin. I'm going to come back and talk about the progressive nature of this more in a minute, but evidently the misuse of the eyes, particularly in this area, can go so far that you pass what we call the point of no return. It's not that God cannot forgive. It is that man's heart has become so hardened that he can't turn away from sin. And here's a great side lesson out of that. We sometimes talk about Christian growth. I like to describe it this way. Just draw a diagonal line from your left up to your right. And think about this. You are either in the process of growing and moving toward God, or you are moving away from God. There's no middle ground. That you don't reach a level point where you just sort of laid out. You're either making progress or you're not. And if you're not moving ever closer to God, then you're moving the other direction. And as long as you are moving the other direction, you are approaching that point somewhere, that inevitable point where you can't come back. Does that not frighten you? It scares me to death. Somebody said, if one thing scares you half to death and somebody else scares you half to death, where are you? Don't worry about that. But it ought to frighten us, should it not? And so the lust of the eyes that misuses the beauties that God has made. And sometimes we think, well, why can't I just make that simple glance, that little glance? But that glance can very rapidly turn into a gaze that becomes a chain of bondage to the soul of a man that eventually will destroy his life. Let me give you a second area. That's the lust of the eyes associated with materialism, the things of this world. We live in an age where we've collected our stuff, have we not? You ever thought about that? I have my stuff and you have your stuff. And every year about summertime or springtime, we take some of our winter stuff and put it away, and we get our summer stuff out. And then come fall, we get our fall stuff out and we put our summer stuff up. My kids come to visit me. We move our stuff out of the way so they can put their stuff in the closet. And you know what America has done? They filled their attics with their stuff. They backed their $30,000, $40,000 automobiles out into the driveway, and they filled their garages up with their stuff. And now we've reached a generation that is very unique in American society. The generation of the storage shed. The generation of the storage shed. I wonder if it's going to be like 1,000 years from now when archaeologists are digging through the remains of a country that once was so glorious and so powerful, and they come across this sign that says, "Use store." They try to figure out what that is. Our generation is described as a generation of stuff. We find satisfaction or seek trying to find satisfaction in things that cannot satisfy. The material things of life cannot give us the fulfillment in life. You remember what Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and do what? Keep His commandments. For this is... The word duty does not appear, well, it appears, but it's in italics. It's not really in the original. And what I've been told is that if you were to read that without this is the whole of man. The very essence of man is his search for God. And the search for material things, the acquisition of material things, this lust of the eyes, is as dangerous, in fact, even more dangerous sometimes than actually the acquisition of those things. You remember when Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and he warned Timothy about those that are rich. He wanted him to express certain things to those that are rich. And one of the things that Paul says to Timothy in that passage is he reminds us that we came into this world with nothing, and we're going to leave this world with nothing. And then he makes this startling observation. They that are, pick this word up, they that are minded to be rich fall into these hurtful lusts and these desires. Minded to be rich, there's the lust, the desire for material things. And so what do? We set out to acquire those things, and we throw caution to the wind in so doing. When I was living in Oklahoma and preaching in a small congregation in Oklahoma, to the east of me there was another congregation, the Lord's people. The preacher there and we struck up a fond friendship. We participated in a lot of activities together. I would go there and conduct a meeting. He would come to Tupelo and conduct a meeting. Tupelo, Oklahoma, by the way. And he was telling me one day of one of his deacons had set out, he determined, I'm going to become a millionaire. That became his all-consuming desire. I'm going to become a millionaire. Within the space of 3 or 4 years, the man ended up divorcing his wife. He left the church. He was withdrawn from, and the last he had heard from him, the man was in jail serving a prison term for doing what? He took a lead pipe and he almost beat his neighbor to death. For what reason? The man's fence was 6 inches over into his property. And he told that man he wanted that fence removed, put over back on his own property. The lust of the eyes, the desire to become a millionaire led to that man's ruin, not only spiritually speaking, but also physically speaking as well. Let's move to our third point very quickly. Let's talk about the dangers. If the devil could persuade man that just a little sin is not all that bad, he will have made great strides toward destroying that individual. But essentially, that's what the devil has done. He very gradually has brought into our social fabric, our American fabric, the idea that sin is not really that bad. He's redefined terms to a large extent. Adultery, nothing more than an innocent little affair. Drunkenness, it's a disease. Homosexuality, it's an alternate lifestyle. Transgender behavior is now gender identification. Theft is social maladjustment, and the prodigal son was nothing more than a juvenile delinquent. You could go on. The perpetual liar is an extrovert with imaginative talents. Well, can I put that into, these shall not enter into heaven, the extrovert with unimaginative talent. A good storyteller, but telling lies, you don't want to mention that. Murder is, through abortion, is pro-choice. The lazy are underprivileged, and the irreligious and profane person, he's just simply open-minded and tolerant. Borrowing the words of Carl Manager in a famous book, a good book that he wrote, Whatever Happened to Sin? Why don't we use the three-letter word anymore? Sin, that's what it is. And when the Bible approaches that, God's trying to warn us of the dangers of what that will do. And we've come so far in our society that now our public school system is being used as an instrument in the devil's hand to confuse the minds of our children who are growing up, so much so that they don't even know whether they're a boy or a girl anymore. And we don't even know which bathroom to go to. And we become so confused we have to have our politicians over in Washington try to decide to pass laws that'll tell us what bathroom to use. What's happened to the human race? What's happened to our beloved America? It is this thing called sin that has so destroyed the ability of man to think. I want to take both of the previous things that I'd talk about, and I want to make the application here on the dangers. What about the danger of the lust of the eyes in just looking? And some, because they've dumbed down definition of terms, and they've convinced themselves that just a little bit, just look. We can look, but don't touch and you'll be all right. And I've heard this foolish analogy of a little boy that's standing in a window looking in at the candy jar, and he's looking but he's not touching. Well, that'd be fine if we were dealing with candy jars, but we're not dealing with candy jars. We're dealing with the souls of men, are we not? And so when you start dealing with the lust of the flesh, one area that becomes very serious is the changing attitudes toward pornography. I'm going to give you some thoughts on defense in a minute, but what it boils down to is you have to protect those eyes. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. And it is that opens the gate for so much that is horrible and has changed and destroyed the lives of so many. Our attitudes toward pornography have changed dramatically. This is an article from the Gospel Advocate, the January Gospel Advocate of this year. I read this as I was preparing this lesson. And in that article, the author made this observation. According to a 2016 study of evangelical churches, 41% of practicing Christian male teens, that's between ages of 18 and 24, catch these numbers, folks, if this doesn't stagger the imagination and the thoughts, 41% and 13% of practicing female teens struggle with pornography. But it's not only affecting our youth. 21% of youth ministers and 14% of preachers admit to struggling with pornography. And if Barna Group's survey is anywhere close to accurate, you have to take into account that not everybody is honest with the questions. I have no doubt that the statistic could be a whole lot worse. Now, second danger with this lust of the eyes is, and I mentioned this earlier, is this thought of the progression of sin. I give this illustration. One author has said there's two ways to come down from the top of a ladder. You can either jump off the ladder in one fell swoop, or you can come down a step at a time. But either way, what's going to happen? You're going to reach the bottom. That's a great illustration. The progressiveness and the power of sin is evident in so many passages. One of my favorite is Psalms chapter 1, where the psalmist writer said, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scoffer." There's progression not only in the nouns, but in the verbs as well. Here's a man who happens to walk. He's going to avoid, within his power and capability, I'm going to stay away from things that are bad. I'm not going to let my feet trod in the pathway of sin and temptation. But if in his daily walk he happens to come in a confrontation with temptation, what does he do? He doesn't stop and stand there and gaze in and look in. For should he do that, then eventually he'll end up entering in and sitting down in a fixed position with those who are so engaged. Walk, stand, sit. You see the individual going from the ungodly to the sinner, man that shakes his fist in the face of God, rebels against God's will, to the scoffer who now mocks God. It's progressive. It does happen. And yet it's so gradual that sometimes we don't pick up on that. I don't know where I came across this quote from J.C. Ryle, but I think it captures the essence of the danger and the lust of the eyes. There are two ways of coming down from this ladder. One is to jump down, and the other is to walk down one at a time. I don't have a great opportunity to watch television. In fact, Johnny Ann and I pulled the plug on television 30 years ago now. There's not anything fit to watch anymore. It's just, why pay the monthly fee to just get a couple of channels you can watch? So we pull it, and as Brother Jimmy was talking this morning about Leave It to Beaver and Bonanza and all those good, clean shows, that's what we watch. We buy discs and watch things like that when we desire to do that. But one of the television shows that always impressed me, it was called Doc, if you ever had a chance to see it. Billy Ray Cyrus starred in it, and he played the part of a country-born fellow who found himself practicing medicine in New York City. And so many good lessons were taught in that series. But on this particular occasion, one of his fellow acquaintances, Nate was a policeman, and Nate was tempted to protect one of his fellow officers who had been pilfering drugs. But as the story unfolded, honesty won the day, and Nate did what was right, and he stood by his guns. And in every episode, at the end, Doc you'd show him in his room, and he'd open up his laptop like this, and he'd type an email to his mentor, a doctor up in Wyoming where he had grown up. And on this particular occasion, he typed this quote to his mentor, and I love this: "Even in the little things, do what is right, 'cause a soul is seldom sold in one great auction. Instead, it is bartered away in 1,000 tiny trades, a little bit at a time." That's the way sin works. Very quickly, let me talk about a defense. Give you 4 quick points under this. These are not original. I got these from Brother Alan Webster, and in fact, found his original lecture, his original article in one of the Power Lectures, one of 2012. And so I wrote him, I said, "Can I use your thoughts and then expand on them?" And he gave me permission to do that. But Brother Webster said the greatest way to deal with sin, so far as the lust of the eyes is concerned, is to be like Job. And you remember that Job in chapter 31, verses 1 through 12, he deals with things that he had overcome as a temptation to turn away from God. And one of those was the temptation for the misuse of the eyes. And it is in that passage that Job makes the observation. He said, "I made a covenant with my eyes. How then shall I look upon a virgin?" A covenant with the eyes. And that's what Brother Webster expanded upon. He gave 4 suggestions. Number 1, he said, when you make a covenant with the eyes, you set a goal. That's what you do. I know a man who years ago was tempted to engage in pornography, and the key to his success and overcoming it was this. He said, "I have made a promise to God. I sat down in the quiet hours of my study, and I made a promise to God. And now every time," he said, "every time that I come across one of those links that might take me in the wrong direction, just because of the caption, because of the picture, he said, I don't even click on that, because as soon as I see that, I remember I made a promise to God. And when we make promises to God and we fix those in our mind, they become daily reminders that we're committed to God, not to ourselves. Brother Webster then says there's a second thing that a covenant with the eyes does, and that is it aligns priorities and fortifies resolve. If I make a covenant with my eyes, I now know what really is important. Johnny Ann and I stood at the marriage altar 50 years this coming October, and we made a promise to care for each other. And that set my priorities. Everything in my life has been toward meeting the promises that we made on that day 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago now. But priorities, losing sight of proper priorities is one thing that gets us into trouble, whether it's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, or the vainglory of life. It sets priorities. Number 3, Brother Webster pointed out that it actually, a covenant with the eyes moves us to remorse. If I've made a promise with my eyes that I'm not going to look on things that are evil, and I'm tempted toward that end, the remorse strikes immediately. Guilt starts setting in the very moment I break that covenant. And so the remorse is developed godly sorrow that then obviously leads to repentance. And then last of all, Brother Allen pointed out that an eye covenant gives us a tool for building character, and it does. And really that's what it's all about, is character. We want to be godly men and women. We want to be men of the book, men with character. I like what Henry Ward Beecher, at least he's credited with having written this. It's not what a man gets, but what a man is that he should think of. He should think first of his character and then of his condition. For if he has the former, he need have no fear of the latter. Character will draw condition after it. When God sent Jeremiah into the streets of Jerusalem, Jeremiah, see if you can find me a man. That's not the word Adam. That's a word that means a man of nobility and character. And I fear that if God were to send one of his prophets today into the streets of America, could he find a noble person? I'm glad we still have that leavening influence in our society, but it's so rapidly disappearing. Lust of the eyes will eat away as a canker at the soul. It'll rob a man of his strength. It will render its victim powerless against the things that war against the soul. And so as we think upon the definition of the terms and how those things, when they're expanded out and stretched out, the application, the areas of application, the dangers, really dangers in that. And then concentrate on the defense. I think God will help us to overcome the lust of the eyes, make us better men and women, and prepare us for that eternal home when once we arrive, our eyes will behold the beauties of heaven and the home that's prepared for us. Don't give that up. Don't give it up. Stay faithful, and heaven will be your home. Thank you very much.